Okay. Today's speaker is no stranger to the Schemel Forum. The prize-winning Worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer can be read in the Scranton Times-Tribune, always broadening our understanding of the world. Trudy has visited countries where angels fear to tread, where violence is rampant and democracy has no place. She has a knowledge of the world that is epic in scale. Recently, we worked together on a very serious project. That is, helping our friend Soraya Paksad to escape from her native land, Afghanistan. Soraya is the founder and president of a nonprofit organization called Voice of Women, known worldwide for its support of women and girls, getting them an education, training, and skills that make them modern, self-reliant people. Voice of Women is anathema to the Taliban, and the Taliban has taken over the government of Afghanistan. They sought Soraya out by name to be killed. Trudy, with her worldly knowledge and her personal empathy, along with our Senator Bob Casey, was able to get Soraya airlifted to Germany, even as the Taliban was hunting her down. Trudy's empathy matches her journalistic skills. Please welcome her to the podium.
Thanks very much, Sandra. And I'm sorry that I'm not there to see all of you in person and have lunch afterwards, but it is what it is. And hopefully soon the Schemel Forum can go back to inviting guests in person, up close and personal. But anyway, thank heavens for Zoom. And so the topic today couldn't be more timely. Biden and the world, 7 months in, how is he doing? As most of you probably know, President Biden goes before the United Nations tomorrow morning, actually, and he's going to be speaking about the case for the world to act more speedily against the coronavirus, about climate change, and about human rights abuses, among other issues, and calling for greater global partnership. But of course, this kind of appeal comes at the same time as some of our closest allies are becoming skeptical about US foreign policy. The big difference with Biden from President Trump, former president, is that he understood, at least he said he did, the value of allies, especially alliances in countering the advances and increasing aggressiveness of China. And the allies, you've seen in the past week with France, but even before that, with the way the United States exited from Afghanistan, are beginning to wonder whether President Biden is really focused more on America first than on strengthening alliances, and also wondering if he is Trump redux in a nicer form, more courteous, more amenable to nice meetings, but when it comes to shove, whether he really is willing to stick a knife in their backs, which they had come to expect from President Trump. And now I think it's a mistake to align Biden with Trump. There really is a basic conceptual difference in the way he intends to carry out foreign policy, but he has stumbled. Sometimes it's his fault and sometimes not, I would argue. So what do I mean? In order to lay that out, I want to go back to a column that I wrote in April on the 100 days anniversary of Biden's presidency. It may be unfair to always do this 100 days business, but it's done. And I wrote, Biden's first 100 days of foreign policy deserve good grades. And I looked at certain categories. I gave him an A for policymaking process, personnel, and professionalism. I said that the country can be grateful that from the get-go, Biden restored sanity and professionalism to the foreign policy making process. And I argued that he was tougher than President Obama and light years more savvy and strategic than the erratic tweeter who made foreign policy in 280-word bursts. I thought at the time that the choice of Jake Sullivan as National Security Advisor was an excellent one. Tony Blinken is Biden one step removed. So I thought, okay, there's a foreign minister who's exceedingly close to the president and basically echoes his viewpoints. You might argue that a cabinet of rivals sometimes might be more useful, but in this case, in this period of time, I thought it was a good idea that there was a cabinet that could work closely together. And I thought they would be open to ideas from outside. I gave Biden an A- on reviving alliances in Europe and Asia, and argued it would be hard to rebuild trust. But I thought he was doing almost as good a job as he could do. On combating the pandemic, I gave him an A- B+, not for his domestic moves, which I thought were terrific, but because he was slow to share excess vaccines with the world. On China policy, I said it was still in development, and I gave him a B+. I said he was tough in a far shrewder way than Trump. Russia relationship A+. You certainly, no one could be worse than Trump. Anyone could be better, but I thought that it was clear that and excellent that Biden had made very publicly evident that he was no longer going to kowtow to Putin. Then we come to Afghanistan, which I then gave him a C-, because I believe then, believe now, that we should have left a small troop presence, which I'll get into later. And I was annoyed even back in April that there was not sufficient progress in getting translators out back at a time when we had the full ability to do so. And we were clearly lagging, even under Biden, in doing the necessary streamlining of the visa process. I gave him an incomplete on Iran. We can get into that in questions about then and now later. But let me move then to where I think the problems lie now. The central basis of Biden's foreign policy, it has become clear, much clearer than it was back in April, is that he believes we have to look at China as an aggressive competitor that basically wants to sell its authoritarian model to the world and to achieve strategic superiority to the United States and economic superiority in coming years, and to use that superiority to squeeze other countries, including democracies, that don't go along with China's vision for the world and devotion to the autocratic model as the best shape and ideology for other countries. You can see in the speeches that Biden has given that he truly believes we're at a pivot point where democracies have to prove that they can work, and autocracies are trying to demonstrate that democracies can't work and their model is superior. In February at the Munich Forum, the Munich Strategic Forum, Biden said, we're at an inflection point between those who argue that autocracy is the best way forward and those who understand that democracy is essential. In March, he told reporters, on my watch, China will not achieve its goal to become the leading country in the world, the wealthiest country in the world, and the most powerful country in the world. And in April, he said that the world was at an inflection point in determining, quote, whether or not democracy can function in the 21st century. Now, the reason that I gave Biden a good grade on China policy in April is that I thought he recognized something essential that President Trump never grasped, which is that the issue of China's strategy had to extend beyond exporting soybeans. It had to extend beyond trade policy, that the critical element in proving that the democratic model could work and preventing an authoritarian China from controlling many institutions, waterways, and politics in the international politics in the world. The critical element was that the US domestically had to catch up with a China that was leaving us behind in many key areas, especially in critical areas of future-oriented science. And those areas of science were going to dominate not only economics, but warfare in the future, artificial intelligence, quantum physics, the futuristic sciences that operate on the internet, that operate off of satellites, and where the United States was lagging behind in its focus. We had long needed a Sputnik moment, and we hadn't yet had one. And we had to catch up and prove that we could develop, redevelop, renew a country where education was first rate, where inequality was slashed, and where scientifically our own students could compete in physics, in mathematics, in computer science, because otherwise China was going to leave us in the dust. Biden understands that. And so domestically, on China policy, the centerpiece of his foreign policy outlook, domestically, I think he has tried to do the right thing. The Congress has passed a couple of packages, including the COVID stimulus and a package that focused on science and technology boosting, that will give more money to universities, to the research arm of the Defense Department, that will try to get Silicon Valley and the Pentagon's research arm and universities to work together instead of at cross purposes, that will start to expand scientific education in high schools. So the goal has been partially funded domestically. We have yet to see how it works out in practice. So domestically, I think Biden is pursuing the right objectives, but he is coming up against our divided politics. And in his $3.5 billion package, and in his infrastructure plan, where he is trying in a couple of fell swoops to bring us up to where the Chinese are now and where they're headed, he is attempting in a very short time to correct mistakes that have been made for decades in our bridges, in our airports, in our rail system, in our air system, where the Chinese are pushing ahead of us, bullet trains all over China, new ports, automated. He wants to do it all at once, and you see what happens. Congress is divided politically, and on issues where you would think the Republicans understood we needed to move, it is still a huge struggle. And on societal issues, where Biden understands correctly that there are too many divisions for our country to move ahead and be a model for the world, the Republicans are dead opposed. So I would say that on foreign policy, which is tremendously and tightly linked to domestic, Biden is undercut drastically by the divisions in this country, which are openly witnessed by the rest of the world. The same holds true when it comes to COVID. Biden moved directly out of the box to get this country vaccinated. President Trump, yes, had helped with some funding and some push for development of vaccines, but had totally failed to provide any clear organizational linkage between the feds and the states and localities, without which you could not deliver the vaccine. Biden came out of the gate, pushed forward the infrastructure, made enormous progress initially, and has been thwarted again by domestic politics, which is criminal. And Biden, I believe, and we'll see tomorrow, wanted to be in the forefront of a push to vaccinate the world, but had hoped by this time that the political necessity of vaccinating America first would have resulted in a tremendous success story. Instead, the US is now looked on by the world as incompetent or not professional enough, or even a failure. The Europeans, who initially were ahead of us, then fell behind us on vaccine, are now ahead of us. Israel is ahead of us. The Asians, which initially who were tremendously ahead of us in curbing the expansion of the virus, fell behind on vaccines because they hadn't thought they needed them and then had to face Delta, but are now moving ahead. And also in masking, we're always ahead. And again, we're falling behind because of domestic politics. So in these areas, which are critical for America's standing in the world, the disappointments in Biden's performance are not solely resting on the head of this administration. They are self-inflicted wounds that are caused by the hideous domestic politics of this country. And they further harm an American image that has been deeply wounded by January 6th, by the continued attack by Trump and his followers on free, fair elections, the attacks that go on within states. And so America's image abroad, respect for the United States, has slid because domestic politics hold us back. But then I want to come to the categories where I gave Biden excellent grades in reviving alliances and in professionalism. And here is where, excuse me, I am truly worried about the competence of the Biden team to do the job. Afghanistan stands as the prime example of the absence of professionalism, of farsightedness, and of linking globally the impact that actions in one part of the globe have on the prime focus of the Biden administration, which is confronting Chinese aggression, because things that happen in Afghanistan do impact the future relationship with China, even though Biden views it differently and simply wanted to clear Afghanistan and forever wars off the plate so he could focus fully on China. Even if you start from the assumption, and I don't, but we can discuss that during questions, that we should have pulled out totally. The way the handling of this exit, the way it was handled, it just astonishes me in its willful blindness to what was going on in the ground, in the administration's willingness to constantly make statements that bore no relationship to what was going on the ground, in the mishandling of the evacuation, in misunderstanding of the strength of the Afghan military. It just still shocks me that the US was so oblivious to facts that you didn't need highly classified intelligence to see. I once put together a book of my columns on Iraq in 2004 called Willful Blindness, the Bush administration and Iraq. And if I were putting together a booklet of the columns that I've written in the last 6 months, I would say willful blindness, the Biden administration and Afghanistan. I've mentioned the issue of translators. I know not everyone may think that this is a critical issue for American foreign policy, but in fact, it's a much bigger issue than many people realize. There was a bipartisan desire in Congress to get out these translators who were so critical over 20 years to the American military. Legislation was passed in 2008 to get out Iraqi translators and then Afghans. This has been around for a long while. President Trump nearly shut down the program in his last year in office. Very few translators from Afghanistan got out. But the administration was aware of it from the time it stepped in. It was also aware that it wanted to get out of Afghanistan as soon as possible. In my view, there was no excuse for not starting a process that got the translators out in segments, in tranches, while we had control of Bagram military airport. It could have been done in stages. The legislation was there. The Biden administration says they couldn't evacuate people because it would have started a panic. The panic started back when President Trump said that we were going to get out by May 1st of this year. And the panic was accelerated when President Biden said we were going to get out first by September 11th and by August. So getting the translators out was keeping a promise. And the Chinese and the Russians are rightfully making hay out of this, saying to anyone who considers America an ally, this is how you will be treated. And they are broadcasting this. The Chinese are daily to Taiwan saying, has America done anything about Hong Kong, even though they claim there's injustice? Has America stood by its allies in Afghanistan? And it's an issue that has caused enormous consternation in Taiwan, which is the centerpiece of our military activities regarding China, to prevent China from taking back Taiwan by force. So this has a lasting impact. But then you come to the way that the evacuation was conducted and the misunderstanding about what was happening on the ground. I can tell you, any longtime historian dealing with Afghanistan, and I've talked to a lot of them, was fully aware that in Afghanistan, when there's the sense that things have shifted dramatically, one occupier is leaving, another is on the verge of taking over. And believe me, the Taliban are an occupier, even though they're Afghan. And I can get into that later. People have to judge which way to jump. The Afghan army was never 300,000, which Biden kept saying. Everybody knew it was really half of that. There was corruption in Kabul. The ordinary soldiers weren't getting paid. They weren't getting food. And the key is that they all knew that once the US left, they would have no effective air force. The US trained an air force and an army on US standards, which the Afghans could not maintain. They couldn't maintain Black Hawk helicopters. They couldn't maintain M16 rifles. I remember when I watched training of Afghan soldiers outside of Kabul, they complained to me about all the maintenance that M16s required, whereas the old Soviet Kalashnikovs, AK-47s, you could drop them in the mud and they would still fire. The same with Black Hawk helicopters versus the Soviet era M17s, which didn't have all of the computer juice, but were tough and easy to maintain. So the Afghans knew that once they no longer had air support, they couldn't hold the cities. And the Taliban made deals with commanders, with leaders. It was very similar to what happened in Mosul in 2008. This was known when I was talking to Afghans on the ground. People were aware. They really couldn't believe the US was going to leave when it did, because they were aware that the country would fall very soon once the US left. And the 2,500 plus 7,500 Europeans, plus 8,000 contractors, these people were not fighting on the front lines. They were taking no casualties, but they were maintaining both maintenance, logistics, and morale, not to win. It was no longer a question of winning. It was a question of preventing the Taliban from taking over, in the long-term hope that eventually there could be a wider negotiation with all of the neighbors of Afghanistan and somehow India and Pakistan, and you'd get some kind of negotiated solution. Because Pakistan is the key to the war in Afghanistan. If Pakistan didn't arm and train the Taliban and give them safe haven, that war would have ended a long time ago and the Taliban wouldn't have won. So you really needed a bigger negotiation. And in the meantime, you needed to prevent the Taliban from taking over. So why the Biden people didn't see this? I think it was willful blindness. They believed there would be a decent interval before the Taliban took over. And by then, Biden would have achieved many other objectives and people would have forgotten about Afghanistan. This, to me, smacks of incompetence, as does the misunderstanding of the moral and strategic importance of getting the translators out. And it also smacks, again, of disdain for alliances. The allies did not want to leave. They were given no advance notice when Biden made his decision to leave. They had to leave with the Americans because they don't have the logistical capacity to stay there without American lift, American medevac, and so forth. So they were forced into leaving. But then they told the Biden team, they warned them that the Taliban were going to take over. And the Biden team didn't listen. And then when things got bad, they begged the Biden team to stay on in Afghanistan until every one of their people was evacuated. They had translators, they had staff. The Biden team refused. There was no collaborative discussion. And you have to remember that Afghanistan was the first and only time that Article 5 of the NATO alliance was ever used. When 9/11 happened, the other NATO nations all agreed they would stand with Biden no matter what Biden decided to do to strike back against al-Qaeda. They supported the Americans going into Afghanistan. And this was an important symbol of NATO solidarity. And in the end, the Biden team treated the Europeans as cavalierly as Trump had treated them in the past. And, I can tell you in questions, if anyone wants to know, the incoherence of the evacuation and the consequences, while the military did the best it could, and the military had always had plans for evacuating translators and so forth, but it was left in the lurch. The military understood the danger of the Taliban taking over. The State Department, Blinken, and the White House didn't want to listen. So the military did its best, but that figure of 120,000 being taken out, a lot of the people who were taken out were people who just happened to make it onto the airfield. The US is only taking 55,000 of those people. And after you subtract for American citizens and their families, and those who went to Europe because they were European staff or translators, it's not a huge percentage of those who came out, and a lot of them still don't know where they're going. They're stuck on US bases, and even the ones who are here are stuck on US bases because the US helter-skelter took them in and now doesn't know what kind of visas to give them and doesn't have a process to do it. I helped one brilliant young Afghan woman get an admission to University of Pennsylvania to do a master's degree. And she's working on virtual education to try to help the girls who are left behind. And she's stuck in Quantico and is going to have to delay for a year her admission to Penn because they don't allow all the refugees who are stuck in Quantico for weeks being processed to have any internet. So she can't sign up for online classes. Now, I know this sounds minor, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the State Department simply wasn't up to this job. And I know that the State Department was denuded of talented staff during the Biden years. And in fact, in all these months we were pulling out, we did not even have a US ambassador in Afghanistan. Now, I don't know whose fault that is. I think that the Biden administration should have made a priority of putting up somebody good for that job, even though it's a dead end because the person would have only been ambassador for the hellish last month. But still, it was an oversight that to me is unforgivable. And I don't know if the fault lies with Biden or with Congress. But the appearance of this all, the disarray, the misunderstanding that this will now increase Chinese and Russian leverage in Central Asia, in Asia, and beyond, because China and Russia are going to recognize the Taliban. They're going to help the Taliban. They're going to step into the vacuum. And I can go into that further if anyone wants to talk about it later. But this gives the perception of a foreign policy in disarray. This was followed on closely by this strange and bizarre kerfuffle with France. Well, it's more than a kerfuffle, where the Biden administration gave a NATO ally and a leader, Emmanuel Macron, whom Trump had made every effort to show he was close to, made a fool of the French, giving them no advance notice that Australia was going to cancel a $65 billion submarine deal with the French because the Americans were forming a new alliance with a weird acronym name, AUKUS, with Australia and Britain, to try to have a tighter strategic cooperation against China. Now, in principle, the idea is a good one. What China has done to Australia is a perfect example of what the US is afraid of, a perfect example of the way a newly aggressive China under Xi Jinping is about to start treating, or is already treating, democracies, because it feels that its economic and military weight is so strong now, and America is so weakened that it can simply apply new international rules by fiat. So what happened is that when Australia made a request to China for further investigation into the origins of COVID, and we still don't know the origins. We don't know whether it was an accidental lab leak. We don't know whether it was a bat virus that jumped from an animal to a human, or from a bat to another animal and a human. And it's very important to know that in terms of preventing the next pandemic. When Australia asked for a further investigation because the WHO was not able to gather the data it was seeking from China, the Chinese retaliated by making a major cut in Australia's agricultural exports to China. Australia's exports had been heavily oriented towards China. It is trying to shift that, but it has a long way to go. And, that adds, for example, to the kind of cultural slaps that China has illustrated, for example, the National Basketball Association, when the general manager of the Houston Rockets said he stands with Hong Kong. China banned a TV coverage of the NBA, which is very important, big in China and important to the NBA's bottom line, banned it for a year. China is in a position to truly throw its economic weight, its cultural weight, and its military weight when it comes to South China Sea and Taiwan Straits. And it is starting to show that it thinks it can do that without any pushback from affected countries. So this alliance, which would give Australia 60 nuclear-powered submarines, not nuclear armed, which would enable these subs to move faster, further, and quieter, and give Australia more ability to track what China is doing in sea space that affects Australia. It's very important. And apparently, so I understand, even if France had switched from diesel subs, which was the original contract and which would be outdated by the time it delivered the subs in 10 years, even if it switched to nuclear, those subs would not be as capable as what Australia is now going to get. But to do it in the way that Biden did, without giving France a clue, even though you had personal meetings between Biden and Macron, you had very recent meetings between Blinken and his counterpart in Paris, where the French foreign minister was talking about the submarine deal. You had a meeting only days before between the French defense minister and the Australian defense minister. And then suddenly this is announced and the French find out on the news before they find out from the Americans. Now, if you want to present even the image of close NATO cooperation in the future, let alone the reality of working with democratic alliances to stand up against Chinese and Russian aggression, then you need to find some way of treating your partners with respect. I don't know, the ins and outs of how this could have been done, or whether a payoff could have been arranged to the French, or whether the French somehow could have had a role in production of the submarines. I don't know the intricacies. All I know is that the way it was done, causing France to withdraw its ambassador from the United States for the first time in the entire history of relations between France and the United States, was not the right way. And the administration, in unnamed sources, has sloughed this off by saying, oh, it'll all be papered over. Well, maybe so. But the fact is, these wounds linger at a time when the alliance needs to show solidarity, the alliance with Europeans and the alliance with Asians. And Biden is making a point in the next week with the UN. He's going to meet the Australian Prime Minister. He's going to meet Boris Johnson. I don't know whether in person or digitally. He's going to meet with Asian leaders. But if he stands for democracy, as he says he does, if he wants to have a conference of democracies, if he presumably understands that we can't export democracy as we tried to do in Afghanistan and Iraq, but he wants to prove that democracies can function in the 21st century and support each other against authoritarians, especially China, which will be, no matter what we do, a massive global power in this century, then he has to tighten alliances, not disdain them, as Trump did, even if he talks better language. So, I'm going to wrap up here by saying that I think what we see in Biden foreign policy after 7 months is an understanding that China has to be the central focus, but an inability to demonstrate that America has the professionalism and the competence in its foreign policy establishment to cement its alliances, to work with democracies and counter China in a way that will be effective. Part of the problem, as I said, is not Biden's fault, because I think the critical element is we need to compete adequately with China in the future of science and technology. Missiles, not so much, well, missiles too, but in space and in education and in infrastructure. So it's not all Biden's fault, but the foreign policy establishment right now in Washington is not up to the task as illustrated by recent weeks. And it's got to do better. And it has to up its game. So I'm going to stop there and take questions.
Okay, if you have a question, you can either kind of raise your hand or use the little hand emoji or write in the chat that you have a question. Gino, I'm going to go ahead and ask you to unmute.
Okay. Everything she says is true. Everything. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Everything she said is true. However, I think the most important thing is the pandemic. I think what's going on in the United States, I saw on the TV this morning that more people in Alabama died than were born. That's where we're headed. I mean, the pandemic is most important. It's important that we mandate. We must solve our problem first. That's more important than all our foreign policies.
I don't disagree with you. As I tried to say at the beginning of my talk, that I thought it's not just unfortunate, but tragic that Biden was able to show immense competence and progress in dealing with the pandemic in the first part of his administration, and that the fact that we are where we are has to do with the disgusting politics of those on the right who are deliberately basically encouraging the death of their followers. And so the point that I was trying to make is, the world sees that, and unfortunately, they won't give Biden a pass. I mean, it's a judgment on America, even more than on Biden, that the politics of this country are such that even though we have the capacity, we have a dedicated federal government, we have the vaccine, we are doing so poorly. And I agree with you about mandates. The problem is, as I said, this isn't Biden's fault, but it translates both into a tragic domestic situation and to the impression globally that the United States is either losing its mind or losing its competence. So yes, mandates. I mean, I think this is an enormous tragedy. I also think that Biden has to take the lead globally on trying to round up vaccine on a global scale, because even if the US was doing better domestically, as we all know, you have to deal with COVID elsewhere, or you're going to get, the E variant, the F variant, et cetera, et cetera. But I totally agree with you, Dr. Moore. It's not, this one is not Biden's fault, but we are where we are because of our politics.
David, you have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, actually, it's two separate parts. They may not be that closely related. I'm wondering about the role of corporate America in our foreign policy. With regard to China, they've been worried about things like IP, but they've always seemed to subordinate their long-term interests for short-term things. Now we're looking at supply chain problems where they've basically destroyed domestic production in order to get the cheap or the cheaper products from abroad. And if you go to any store right now, you're seeing shortages. I just came back from a hotel that's having shortages of all sorts of things. And of course, they've also, with regard to China and recently with Russia, where we've seen Apple and Facebook subordinate the American ideal, to the interests of dictators or to authoritarians. And I guess the second part of my question relates to authoritarianism and economics. And I don't know if this is really in your field, but I think there's an open question as to whether authoritarian regimes in the long run can successfully pursue economic policies in the best possible ways. Because if you listen to CNBC this morning, you would have heard the Chinese stock market and the lack of confidence there, and what the accounting firms are being, so that there is no real support there in the background, but they're just willing to go along with it for again, the short-term profits. So I guess they're kind of open-ended, but I'd like to hear your views on those things.
Yes, no, I think they're both extremely important issues. Let me take up the second one first. In many ways, China is the great experiment of our times, of this century, because China has done things that no one imagined any country could do. And for years, I first went to China in 1986. And it was still largely an impoverished agricultural country. People wore Mao suits. When you went to Shanghai, there were almost no automobiles. There were a few vans. Everyone was on bicycles. And for any of you who've been to Shanghai, as you know, now there's two parts of the city, the older part, although the older part has a lot of shishi buildings, and the totally new part called Pudong across the Huangpu River. Pudong was a marsh when I went. Deer grazed on it. Now it's sort of New York and Chicago on steroids. There's bullet trains all over the country. You have internet in the remotest villages, yada, yada, yada. But the fact is, China did something incomprehensible. They went from an impoverished country of 1 point, whatever it was then, billion, to the second most powerful economic country, on the way maybe to becoming the first soon, in 4 decades. How many decades? Deng made his famous speech in Shanghai in 1982. 4 decades. Okay, so all along the way, there were people who said, oh, it's all going to fall apart now. Because first, state-owned industries. The Chinese never shut them down the way the Russians did on US advice in the 1990s, causing massive unemployment. Now she is focusing on state-owned and bringing them back as bigger part owners with private. The banks were going to collapse because so many provinces were giving bad loans because of politics. So the banks, there hasn't been a bank crisis. I only say all this not to say that in the end it might not work, but I'm saying that China has made things work that no economist predicted, or maybe some Chinese experts predicted, but I've followed this for a long time. And they've done things that no one thought could be done. And you ask why? Well, this happens to be a particularly fascinating authoritarian regime. The people are Chinese. There is a high respect for education. There is an enormous capacity for hard work. There is enormous ambition. And right now there's enormous national pride, plus which China always, from 82 on, opened up to the world. So you have enormous cadres of educated people who got their PhDs in Western countries, including ours, who have gone back again because they have such big opportunities that they didn't have 20 years ago, 30. I mean, I used to talk to Wharton grads. They would either stay here or they'd go home reluctantly because they wouldn't be given their head to be imaginative. Now they are. All right, right now there's a turnaround. Xi Jinping is going back to stateism. He's put his hands on the tech industry in ways here that nobody could imagine. Maybe the GOP would like it, but crunch. Jack Ma, one of the biggest high-tech tycoons, has disappeared from public view. He's not in prison, but he's now towing the party line. He wasn't allowed to issue an IPO. The state wants a greater hold on everything. Some people are saying this is going to kill the golden goose, but it's not clear because the Chinese work ethic, the Chinese education system, Chinese nationalism, and competent bureaucrats. Now, not all of them are competent, and there is a lot of corruption. But unlike in Russia, where you have a talented populace, but you have a corrupt regime that only takes and never gives, and is sustained by oil income as if it were a third world country, which it acts like. So far, the Chinese have given back. I mean, people who lived in one-room flats when I first met them in '86 now have nice apartments with flat screen TVs and cars, and their kids go and get educated in the US and Australia. So I don't know if the Chinese will do themselves in. but they are a kind of competitor that we have never had. And you see that the Chinese are willing to use this economic power to pressure people. Now, we Americans use our supreme economic power to pressure people, like secondary boycotts when it comes to people. Europeans who want to invest in Iran are subject to secondary boycotts. So we have used our superior economic power. The way the Chinese are using it is to punish anyone who criticizes them or who tries to thwart them. I think it has the potential to be more ugly than much more ugly than what we do. But the reason they have that growing power is because America has slid, and now it's up to us, which brings us to the business side. You know, in this country, you know, Xi Jinping cannot just call in the tycoons and tell them to snap to and do what the government wants. In this country, I mean, Xi Jinping can do it, Biden can't do it. But I do think and hope that there is some rethinking going on in the business community, especially in Silicon Valley, about the need to cooperate more on helping America move ahead in science and technology. You pointed out what Russia just did in making Google and Facebook take down sites that were used by the Navalny organization to try to get people out to vote for non-Putin candidates. In China, Google and Facebook cannot operate. They refused to do that, and they were kicked out. If you try to get Google in China, you can't. I'm just trying to think, am I misremembering? You can, I think, I'm not even sure you can get Google up, but if you get it up, there are hundreds and hundreds of terms that will not come up. I think you can get it up if you use a VPN, but the terminology, you can't, if you put in Xinjiang, nothing will come up. So this is not new, but now maybe some of the big tech companies are becoming more aware, and we'll see. I mean, I think Biden will have to call people in and talk to them. And obviously there's political dissent within this country between those who believe that such sites need to be censored, if you want to call it that, to prevent incitement to political violence, and those who don't. You know, so there's all kinds of struggles going on over high-tech companies, but I hope in some way the Biden team and those company heads can commune on the fact that we need not just a Sputnik moment, we need a China awareness moment where these companies give back, whether it's to schools, whether it's to cities, whether it's in terms of internet coverage, which is part of this infrastructure bill. I mean, our internet coverage is a disgrace. I was just in Glacier National Park and I could not get coverage. In China, every remote village in the north or the west is covered. So we've got a long way to go, and business will have to be part of it, or it will contribute to our continued decline.
Joe, go ahead. You can unmute.
I think I'm unmuted.
There you go.
All right. I have three quick questions. One is two quotes. One recently from, I believe, the Taliban that said the Americans have the watches, but we have the time. And the other was from, I believe, Joe in Live with Kissinger, who said, he was asked a question by American news reporters, what he thought of Western civilization. He said he thought it would be a good idea. So I think China has like has always had a long-term view of their history, the history of the world, that I think the United States lacks. I'd like to hear your comments on that. Number two, do you have a name or a face? I think Gates said that Biden hadn't made a good foreign policy decision as long as he knew him. Like, who is responsible per se for what happened in Afghanistan in the decision to not leave like 3,000 troops there and the withdrawal? And then number three, I thought I read recently or heard that the United States okayed a Russian pipeline to Germany bypassing Ukraine and Poland. And they weren't happy with that either. And how could they miss what was going on with France? Like, how could, is there a name or a face that could explain why nobody in this country thought France wouldn't be upset with our decision to sell nuclear subs to Australia? Like specifically, like, okay.
Well, I mean, in the answer to the first is that I think the US as a whole was simply overconfident that about the end of history. I mean, that has started to change. But, you know, I remember when Fukuyama came out with that in the 90s, you know, arguing with people that it was a ridiculous thing. Now, if you read his book, it's more nuanced and so forth, but basically it was taken as a slogan, and history never ends. You know, I mean, anyway, unless the whole planet blows up. But we took things for granted that we can no longer afford to take for granted. It was not obvious until the last 20 years that China could forge ahead so quickly. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, there was the mistaken belief that there was no competition out there. And we've suddenly woken up. So that's number one. Who's responsible for the errors in Afghanistan? You know, basically Joe Biden, because the execution, Tony Blinken. But in reality, as I said before, Tony Blinken has been I can't get the two of them, you know, I'm trying to make them into one name. Tony Blinken has been Joe Biden's foreign policy guy, you know, for 20 years or more, going back to when he was at Senate Foreign Relations. So it's really the same voice, but Blinken is the implementation. And you know, Biden, we know Biden has wanted to get out of Afghanistan since 2009. He was against the surge. All right, and you could, there's a lot of arguments on either side about all the mistakes of the last 20 years, yada, yada. But in the here and now, I think Biden came into office convinced that you clear the decks and get on with focusing on China. And somehow was unwilling or unable or not given to absorb the intelligence that Afghanistan would fall once we left. There was this belief, and Blinken was saying it up until June, you know, that they had 2 years. And they were basing it on something where there was no factual comparison when the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan in '89. The Najibullah government lasted almost 3 years, but that was a different world. The Najibullah government lasted until the Soviet Union collapsed, and the Russian government had no money, and so it cut off funds. And then the government collapsed because it couldn't pay its soldiers. So the assumption was, we're going to still keep paying Afghanistan soldiers. It'll last a couple of years. But Najibullah was a hard dictator, a nationalist figure who had some cachet. I'm sure there was corruption, but not like now, because the Russians didn't flood the place with money. And the army was trained toughly and had weapons it could use and was fighting for its life. And so it lasted. It was effectively a national army. The country has gone through decades now of civil war, of drought, of economic problems, of warlordism. And the kind of tough fighters that existed back then, they're either dead or they have long gray hair. It was the same mistake that Blinken apparently made in thinking that the old militias that fought the Russians and then fought the Taliban were going to reemerge. Well, their leaders are either dead or corrupted or brought into the government. And the people who were in those militias, they're now in their 60s, and the younger generation didn't go there. So there were all kinds of misapprehensions, which I don't understand, because any intelligence briefing worth its salt would have told them that. And plus, which the military was telling them that. The Pentagon was unhappy from the get-go, and not because they wanted to send 100,000 soldiers back, but because they knew what was going to happen. And I think Blinken didn't want to listen, Biden didn't want to listen, but they couldn't then face up to the fact that they had to be ready for catastrophe, and they weren't. And they didn't want to evacuate the translators. I think, I've talked to Congress people who have been hucking them on this for months, and veterans organizations, and people in the Pentagon who were angry about it. They never appointed somebody to take on this program from the top and manage it and make it happen. In part, maybe because they thought immigration was a bad political issue. Maybe they did believe it would look like they thought the government would fall, but I think they could have done it over time. Anyway, I think Blinken bears heavy responsibility, but you can't fire Blinken without firing Biden. With the pipeline, I think it was a mistake. I think that here, Biden wanted to pacify an ally, Merkel. The Germans were very hot about this. I think it was a mistake. If he was going to screw France, which actually puts fighting troops on the ground, but he wasn't willing to screw Germany, which basically only puts peacekeepers on the ground. And France, why did they do it this way? Again, I've just been in Montana for a week, so I'm just really getting back to calling people. But I see quotes saying they didn't think the French would get this angry. If they didn't, they were as dumb as they were on Afghanistan. I mean, how could they think the French wouldn't get angry to have a $65 billion deal canceled without any advance notice? But what's worse than that is basically being told, we don't want you on our team in Asia. But Britain is on the team in this. And France had a very sharply defined Asia strategy. They want to put ships in Asia to help with the things that America wants help on. I mean, they're serious about the military. So that's why I'm really bewildered about the professionalism and competence of Tony Blinken and his staff. And I expected more from Jake Sullivan, but I know that Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has been overruled on many things. And I'm trying to find out if he was overruled on France, but I don't know yet.
All right, thank you.
Sandra.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yep. All right, Sandra, go ahead and unmute. Try again.
Still muted.
Yeah,
Okay,
there you go.
okay. Yeah, do you, how much do you think matters that the divisiveness in this country is so great? It's so sort of undoing us in a way, you know, when almost half the people in the country don't believe that Biden was elected. You know, it seems to me that there's a kind of domestic illness here that affects our performance.
Excuse me, there's no question. I mean, maybe the Chinese are right. I mean, a lot of strategic experts think if, a country divided against itself can't stand.
Yeah.
If, as the doctor said earlier in this discussion, COVID is central. The economy can't make a full rebound, even if the stock market is doing fine, except for, a dip here and there. We don't know where the future lies on that. And we cannot lead the world on many issues when we can't lead our country out of the Delta virus. And so that is purely politics, and it's tragic
That's
because
the word.
the GOP is leading us towards second place status in the world. And this isn't about winning the gold medal. This is about the most prominent democracy falling behind China because of our own internal confusion and divides. And I don't know none of us know what the answer is, as we all sit, waiting the by-election.
Yeah. It's disturbing because it is kind of a disease, and it's hard to get to it, to heal.
Well, it's a disease equal in potency to COVID. And, you can argue about whether Biden's New Deal with 3.5 trillion is too much, or it's going to cause inflation. You can have discussions about that. Sure. And I understand why he wants to do it all now, because they're afraid they'll lose their majority. He wants to change the frayed social network into something substantive. And I support him in principle.
Yeah.
But what's terrifying is the lack of professionalism and incompetence that's being demonstrated both in foreign policy and really on the southern border. You worry that all of this money being passed, that the bureaucracy and the leadership may not be, and the divisions, the political divisions, even if the bills pass, they wouldn't be able to implement what they're passing the money for. So I think COVID is the symbol of our times.
Disturbing.
Does anyone else have any question?
I think I thought I saw Mike Squires.
Yes, I just in chat sent a sentence from a foreign policy story that was done on a Harvard study that said that a quarter of the senior staff of the State Department had left in 4 years under Trump. And I just imagine that, not to take anything away from what wasn't done correctly, but certainly State Department was only one place where a lot of the professionals, whether they were scientists or they're state employees, where departments were just left without the kind of bureaucracy that made these places run. And I don't think that should be overlooked, because it just puts enormous pressure, even on trying to make major decisions when you have lots of fires going on and no one to deal with them.
No,
So,
I think that's a valid point. And there's now, there's 70 or more ambassador positions waiting to be filled. And the one Republican has just announced that he will hold up confirmation. I guess it can be done. Will hold up confirmation unless the Democrats cave on, I forget what. But it really is sickening that you can hold up nominations of ambassadors who are critical for foreign policy as a blackmail for something on domestic policy, but it's another sign. I mean, that's not new. It's happened many times historically, but it seems to happen now on a mass basis, which again is a sign of our times.
Any more questions?
Can I ask another quick question?
Quick.
Do you think that down deep in the State Department and the military, they never truly believed that we'd fully pull out of Afghanistan? There would always be another reason to stay in, like we've had for 20 years. And that as a result, that things never fully got carried out in terms of aiding the or aiding the pullout or contributed to the disaster that we saw.
No, because those are decisions that come from the top. I mean, in other words, the way it works is the policy, comes from the president, secretary, and national security advisor, and then it trickles down. And so they know the policy and they have to activate the personnel. I mean, there were constant decisions made. For example, everyone knew there were 18,000 translators potentially in the queue, but they also knew that the process for completing those applications for so-called SIV visas for translators have been taking 2 years, 3 years, sometimes more. And there was no effort to totally revise the policy. Blinken told Congress last week in testimony, well, he put 50 more people on at state. Yes, but all they were doing was trying to speed up the paperwork through state, but it didn't even touch on the security issue. And the problem is, if they had tried to evacuate people under the current policy, they would have had to evacuate them, say, to Guam. And then those people would have had to stay there for 2 or 3 years while this endless process went on. And they had to rejigger the whole thing. And then they had to be willing to have those people stay. But most of those people had gone through 2, 3, 4 security checks already when they worked for the military. And so they weren't willing to focus on it. And that's what I kept hearing from congressmen like Moulton, who was very active on this, from senior people in the Pentagon. They said, we're ready to go, but the order has to come from the White House. And it was the same with state. Nothing moves until you give the order. And then you find the staff. If it's an emergency, you move them from somewhere else. But the unwillingness came from the top. The unwillingness to confront the reality, because the assumption was that they had all this time, and even after the pullout, they were going to keep grinding along with an embassy in Kabul, maybe 100 here, 100 there, slowly. And the bottom line was, as I said, willful blindness. Even if they were partially diluted, they should have known that at best they only would have had until the fall. Well, I should say that after this cheery discussion, I just, I wanted to mention something that for those of you who have any interest in the US Constitution, the National Constitution Center in Philly, tomorrow night they're giving out the Liberty Medal. And I had a column in yesterday on this. I think it's really important for individuals and nonprofits and foundations and to highlight the bravery of individual human rights activists, especially those in jail, because countries are going to be doing less and less of it, including the United States. We can talk a good game about Navalny, but we have no way to get him out of prison, it seems. Or else we haven't used what pressure we have, but there's all kinds of people who are lesser known than he that will not get out. And the award tomorrow is going to Jimmy Lai, the media tycoon whose newspaper was closed and is in prison in Hong Kong, and to Lou Jane Al-Hathloul, who started the women's driving campaign in Saudi Arabia and paid for it with almost 3 years of imprisonment, beatings, and torture. She's now out, but not allowed to speak to the press or leave her home. And so you can watch it on the Constitution Center site. And I only mention it because I want to say there are still people fighting for universal values all around the world, even though the US is somewhat floundering. There are still people who believe in the values that supposedly underline our constitutional system. So we all have to retain the strength to fight for those values too, in whatever way we can.
Well, in closing, I want to assure you that the first 2 sessions were constitutional scholars, Akil Omar and Neil Katyal, and now we have you. And so we feel that our America is worth saving, and we're going to try to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandra and Allison and everyone.